Mystery of the Crystal Lake Longhouse. So this is close to Lake Seymour, but it's actually closer to Crystal Lake. So I thought that would be better. I was thinking of saying the Mystery of the Crystal Longhouse to make it like a science fiction movie, but I don't think that's quite right. So longhouses. So the adventure actually begins a long time ago, actually sitting with Luke Willard in the one of the faculty lounges at Johnson State College. And Chief Luke, in terms of the lore that we were able to get from about 2006 to about 2010, I think that Luke and Peggy Fullerton are probably the two greatest sources for material. Very, very wide-ranging knowledge and very, very deep. And for example, here's Luke out in one of his fields. This is a Marseño, a very specific type of floodplain agriculture that has remained in his family. And then he just would jump over and talk about longhouses or medicines and things like that. So there are a few, real good old time tradition bearers, and Luke is one. So I just wanted to introduce you all to him because he's very, very important in this whole story. And of course, one of the issues is getting this all down. And at first, I used to make handwritten notes, but this is a circa 2006 to maybe 2010 recording set with a Zoom and Asden microphones of all different shapes and sizes and stuff like that. And so what I do is I just take these out and set them up and let people go. And then I can use that and then transcribe. And this is basically what he said. And the important thing is many Nulhegan elders. So this isn't just one person's lore. Okay. Recall the longhouse, yet do not think it unusual or Indian. They remember only that it was built from anything they could find because the Champagnes, the owners of the structure, were so poor. It had no indoor plumbing, required carrying water from a nearby brook. This was a large permanent home, not a tiny temporary camp. It was set in the woods in South Barton, Vermont, overlooking Crystal Lake. Towards the end of its life, the longhouse's bark was patched here and there with commercial tar paper. Oh my God. So here we are, longhouses. And from his original description, I mean, that's what we're talking about that shape and that size. Okay. This is a reconstruction of a Wendat village up in Canada from quite a long time ago. I think it's fallen apart and been replaced. But up until that time, I'd always thought that longhouses pretty well had vanished by about 1750 when either what we call log camp construction of vertical upright logs or frame constructions has moved in. But here's one in the mid-20th century. OMG. So once again, here we go, starting to dive in. And first of all, we've got to justify it. Here's one, in a place that nobody really thinks about longhouses being in. We think of those as either being Haudenosaunee, or perhaps there's one or two known examples of Penobscot ones. And so this is a good example here. The best archaeological example is about a mile from my house. This is a drone shot looking down on a longhouse that probably was a longhouse with a top that was arched instead of a gable. But you notice it's got rounded ends. So probably it would look more or less like this one in the middle, about 30 or 40 feet wide and about 180 feet long. Okay, so it's a pretty big structure and can hold quite a few families. So this is a fascinating example of communal architecture that existed right up to recent times. So the question is, how did people know about this? How much did people know? Where did they get this knowledge? Did people actually go there? Did they visit it? What is the story of this mid-century modern longhouse for the 1950s? Well, one of the ways we can go back and we can look in the Abenaki language, and there is a name for it uh, that exists in the Odanak dialect of the Abenaki language. So it was known within 180 miles of the Longhouse in Martin. So the term existed only as a name. There were no longhouses remaining in Odanak. They have recently built one, but it's very different from the one that we have documented here. So the first question is the location of the Crystal Lake Longhouse. So there's Barton and the interstate. So this gives you a guess about where it is. That's a 2 mile or 1 mile radius. And from everything that I can find from people that I talked to back in the day, it's more or less there. I think what we need to find is someone like Norman Paul, I believe he's still alive, or other people from Nulhegan that remember exactly where it is. I think this is going to be exceedingly important uh, to try to find again because I believe that it should still be some evidence. Luke and other people said it was repaired a lot by tar paper. Okay, tar paper will not rot. So I think even if the framework is gone and all the bark is gone, even though it's supposed to be a rough bark, not birch bark, but if there's any birch bark on it, that might remain. And so I think that would be an interesting puzzle to try to get maybe 20 or 30 people, put them out on a big line like they do when looking for, murdered bodies in the woods and walk it and see if we can find some chunks of that. And then it will have a latrine associated with it. Of course, it will have a fireplace. The descriptions was if the longhouse is facing this direction, so from the inside looking out, it would be about 10 yards in front of the shed um, porch onto the left of it. So we should be able to find that. I think that would be a fun project over the next few years is to locate it again. So memory and imagination. So the rest of this short um, PowerPoint is going to be basically trying to figure out what it looked like. And so the first thing we'll deal with is exterior appearance. So what it's going to look like as you're approaching it. So this is the evidence here. And this is the best. There are several others that are, kind of fascinating. So the walls were made from panels of a rough bark, probably elm or cedar, not birch bark, as was the roof. Now, a lot of other references have Abenaki wigwams being made out of shagbark hickory. No shagbark hickory grows in this area. It's much too cold for it. Okay. So it was probably elm or probably cedar. Probably cedar because it lasts better. Elm you have to replace fairly often. Above the walls was a gabled roof. Instead of being an arched roof, it was just like a modern house. So that's a gable. Okay. The bark house had a shed-roofed, open-sided porch at one end to provide shade for work or rest outside in the warmer weather. It lacked a chimney. There's some people think it may have had a chimney later, probably on a iron pot-bellied stove with just a piece of stovepipe going up. But when this description was, it lacked a chimney. It had a smoke hole, exactly like the recorded ones, with a flap that could be engaged on it. And I don't have the quote here, now, but somebody used to have to go out at night and change the position of the flap. And he was scared because he was afraid of bears, and there were bears in the area. So we've got that level of memory and detail that's associated with it. So those flexible, movable flaps, it's exactly the same thing that's used in the Haudenosaunee and other longhouses. Smoke hole was attached to flap was attached to a long pole. And that's Norman Paul. So finding an analog. So we just happened to have one. This is the Lancaster Longhouse at the 1719 Museum. I did some consulting with the Native organization in the museum there with Seeds of Renewal when I did some work on the Chesapeake Bay region crops. And so I had access to basically being in the longhouse all the time and what I wanted, any way I wanted. So this is what a arched roof longhouse would look like. And remember, ours was gabled. But we'll see descriptions of this lattice work and things like that that binds and holds all of the panels to the sides. So there's an analog that we can actually study and look at. So this would be a close-up of what it would look out like outside. So this is a horizontal, one of these members with the lashing that's holding these panels of bark. And this is replica elmwood bark. Okay. Yes, you can buy those panels. Just the panels to cover that was 140 some $1,000. But it doesn't ever rot, so it's handy. So the next issue is like Sherlock Holmes, we call this forensic rendering. So what we did is I found a gable end longhouse that had a shed on it. And this is the longhouse at Ganondagan State Park over in New York State. Okay, so that was the closest analog that I could find. And so one of my students, who is a very good sketch artist, Amanda Lauder, she visited Norma Paul, in fact, Cheney, with a photograph and had them look at it for a while. And then what she did is having them remember their own memory using the forensic photograph as a baseline. They had her draw a modified sketch from memory, the best guess that they could do. And then what she did is she took the two images and showed them to each other. So two people that shared the memory of the same thing, then with a third reference. Okay, so that grounds them. And then once they all saw what the other person remembered, it jogged new pieces of memory. And so Amanda worked with them to draw up a composite. And that's what you end up with when you have that picture, they show you of a murder suspect. So that's a composite drawing that can be made from 1, 2, or 3 or many witnesses. But the idea is you've got to have these all compared back and forth and have everybody slowly work toward an agreed upon image. So she drew up the composite, and then she, shared that with them. And then there was a little bit more work that had to be. And so when the final was approved by both witnesses, I guess you could say, then the final sketch was made. And here's what the sketch is. So it's a different proportions than the Ganondagan. It has the positions of two smoke holes that were fairly close to each other, which is kind of interesting, rather than scattered along it, because the big longhouses always had several families in them. This was a one large extended family. But interesting enough, there were about 5 or 6 other people with different names other than the owners of this that lived there as well and have deep memories of living there. So that's what it looked like from the outside. And you can see over on the right-hand side, that was where everybody remembered that the outdoor campfire was. And that's where they would do things like boil maple syrup, do the washing and stuff like that. The next thing we've got to start thinking about is, you know, working on the structural framework. So the interior structural framework, of course, is the frame of the building upon which the bark is put. So basically what we're doing, we're approaching it from a distance. We're seeing what it looks like from a distance. Now we've got to go inside and we're going to look up at the framework to see what it looked like before it was, sheathed in bark. And so we have some memory about that. And so the bark longhouse was constructed of a framework of largest poles set vertically in the floor as main framing members. So these were the uprights. Okay, half-inch, 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches. They were cut off with a chainsaw. And so I had my students take those up and show these to them so they could actually feel the diameters to get a estimate of the diameters of these poles. So the upright poles, they're not in this original quote, but those were about 3 to 4 inch diameter ones. Okay. The big Haudenosaunee ones, generally the post holes were on the order of 6 to 8 inches. So this is a little bit more lightweight. And then Ed Davis remembers the smaller sticks. Oh, Ed Davis was the guy that was afraid of bears. Okay. And so he talks about the smaller sticks, which formed the minor framework. And it was made a grid or a lattice work. And the framework was pierced for the smoke holes and a door. Okay. So from that, this is the interior of the Lancaster Longhouse. And so what I did is I just took the quotes and attached long arrows. So you can kind of see what you're doing is you're looking up and you're not looking at the ridge pole, that one that's horizontal about 3/4 of the way up. That's where the gable meets. So if this is the wall, this is the gable, this is the pole here that you're looking at. Okay. So this gives you that grid that you can see the lattice work that then the bark, in this case, the artificial bark, was then lashed down to. So this type of construction is identical to that which anthropologists that study such things say that a standard Haudenosaunee or Wendat longhouse looked like. So, oh my God, it's absolutely amazing. So the two on the side there with the green arrows on the angle, but those are are vertical. So those are the support members for the sides for the gable. Once you are able to get them to describe this, then we can go to analogs and build it. So there's a great image right there. So how is it furnished? Well, there's a huge descriptive literature about the construction of interiors of longhouses. Captives, they were captured by people at Ganawage or Mohawks or anybody. There's a lot of people talked about the interiors of longhouses. There's a very, very specific construction, okay, that was totally unlike that of any Euro-American structure at the time. And so here's some memories. Inside the dwelling, a central hearth built on a dirt floor. Had a fire in the middle where a fire was kept burning. And it lacked regular furniture. Instead, it had built-in furniture made of poles and sticks lashed together. It had built-in furniture for sleeping and storing all along the walls of the building, like bunk beds for the kids to sleep above. There was a small plank floor floor above a table where people ate, and that was it. The rest of it was a dirt floor. So this is the floor and the hearth at the 1719 Museum Lancaster Longhouse. And I'm sorry it's so washed out, but the light was just terrible inside. And so I had to bump it up and do all kinds of fooling around with the image to try to get it so you could actually see the burned logs in the middle of it because the shadows are so terrible. Now, if you notice in the upper left-hand corner quadrant, there is some upright posts, and you'll notice that there's a bunch of sticks horizontally that are facing out there. That is that built-in furniture that that Norman Paul was describing. So here it is in the Lancaster Longhouse. That's exactly how he described it. So how this stuff was made, okay, the uprights that you're seeing there were actually the uprights that support the eaves on the gable, okay, not the center of it. There was no center ridge pole supports going up. So it was made so the gable eaves were supported. Then it had cross pieces above it that supported the ridge pole. So then attached at that one was, and we got the measurements from these guys. The bottom one was about 1.5 feet above the dirt, and the other one was about 4 or 5 or maybe 6 feet. So average guesstimate was 5 feet up. So it'd more or less, be eye height for me. And if you notice, there's a whole series of logs, little logs, saplings facing forward. So that's what I had my students at Johnson. They took all different sizes of these and had the people actually say, what are those horizontal pieces? How big were those? How big were the verticals? How big were all these hundreds and hundreds of sapling sticks to make these actual supports? So we've got the actual average size, diameters of all of these pieces for a detailed construction. But we've got all the different types of lashings that were used, and it's really fascinating. So when we, stop and just think about it, this is probably what it looked like. That's about our best. This is another gable end. Then you can see the way that the poles that support the bunk beds. Now you can see these bunk beds are about 6 feet up. So they're a little bit higher than the Champagne Crystal Lake Longhouse. But this is probably what it looked like on the inside. Looking down on this is about 40 feet. So you can estimate maybe 50. You'd be standing at one end of it, right at the door and looking all the way down. So the amazing thing for me is I can't wrap my head around this. Okay. I've been an archaeologist. I've studied this kind of stuff for years and years and years and years and years. I've been doing a huge amount in the last 35 years of ethnography. And there is no place in the whole Eastern United States that a longhouse that uses post, pole, not post, pole and lashing construction with bark sides and this type of interior furniture. So we're looking at an anomaly in time of probably on the order of, well, let's say 1750, 1850, 1950 minus 2, 180-year gap. So how did this memory persist? Okay. Were people building these all along? and they just slipped under the radar screen. It's just like the language. Remember a long time ago, last fall, I said to myself, we were fools, total fools, to ignore the language when we were just starting to ship it down from Odenak. It was still in existence, and I bet you, this was used up to the late '60s or early '70s. I bet you that structure was still standing, or parts of it, probably all covered with vines and leaves and everything. It was probably still standing when I came up here in the mid late '80s. So that just shows you how much persistence of cultural memory exists here, and how close we came to actually having things that go way, way, way past many of the cultural competencies of other indigenous communities. So this is a lesson and a caution. Now, the interesting puzzle or thing is that, if we wanted to build a longhouse, we have the dimensions, we have the construction, enough information to reverse engineer it. I've worked on at least 4, maybe 5 attempts at building longhouses here in Vermont. Everything from the Huntington Center to the old Ethan Allen homestead back in the middle '90s. Everybody wanted to have one of those in the '80s and '90s. Everybody could build the frame, but there was no place to get the bark. Everybody would end up just with one end being covered with bark. Now that there is this artificial bark, all that's between us and success is, $150,000 to cover it over, and we'll have a permanent example. So I think it's, this isn't really a mystery in the same sense that the other ones are. We go on an adventure, but the adventure started with Luke Willard and me sitting around, early in, I think it was 2009 or late 2008, sitting by the fire in the faculty lounge at Johnson. I brought him up and I started asking information, and he just went, "What?" And this longhouse came in, and I really didn't. I don't know whether I completely believed it at first, but he started describing. It said, "Oh, there's all kinds of people that have been in it." So that blew my mind. So I think we're so lucky to have people that we were able to talk to back in the '90s, they 2000s, and they remember being scared of bears when they had to go flip the flap, the flap flippers, on a longhouse in the 1960s. I think we are very, very, very lucky to have these memories that are written down. And I am so proud of having the grace to have intercepted stuff, and my students that I could, wrestle for a extra credit or their project, send them up there with chunks of wood and charcoal to be able to capture this stuff. So I think there's a, I don't know, it gives you both I want to scream and tear at the air because we missed it by that close. But I think the spirit of it is in the information and transmitted to my students as they drew and measured and brought this back as writings. I guess it is a kind of a mystery, and it certainly does have a interesting ending. So, okay.